Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The Supreme Court has made an important observation highlighting the significance of a secret ballot in a constitutional democracy. The Supreme Court has said that ensuring secrecy of ballot is the cornerstone of free and fair elections, and this principle of secrecy of ballot is the fundamental principle that underlies electoral law, and it is an important postulate in a constitutional democracy. But before we look at this article any further, first let us understand what is a secret ballot. See, the right to vote is a freedom and a choice that we enjoy in a constitutional democracy. See, in a constitutional setup, there can be no kind of coercion on the voter with regard to his voting preferences. And one way of ensuring this is through the system of secret ballot. See, there are a number of entities who can exert pressure on a voter to cast his or her vote in a certain manner. This could be the government, the political parties, the party members, the polling agents and officials present in the polling booth, and as well as your family and friends. But in a constitutional democracy, if elections have to be free and fair, there can be no such coercion on the voter, and one way through which the voter can be coerced or pressured is when these entities force the voter to reveal his or her vote. So if a voter has to be insulated from such coercion and pressure, then he needs to be assured of complete secrecy or confidentiality of his vote. So in order to ensure that the principle of secrecy of ballots is maintained in Indian elections, Section 94 of the Representation of the People Act provides a privilege to the voter. The privilege is that it assures the voter that his choice of vote would be kept completely secret and confidential throughout the electoral process. The responsibility of ensuring this confidentiality falls on the Election Commission of India, and it achieves this through the system of secret ballot. Through the system of secret ballot, the Election Commission ensures that the confidentiality of the electoral process is maintained from the start till the end, and it assures that the voter's choice is not revealed at any point of time to any individual. That's the reason why during elections to the Lok Sabha and during elections to the state legislative assemblies, you would have seen that in the polling booth, the ballot box is kept completely away from all the polling officials and polling agents, and it is enclosed by a cardboard box in order to ensure complete secrecy of your vote. In fact, the Election Commission of India tries to maintain this secrecy and confidentiality throughout the electoral process as well. Similarly, election of the President of India and as well as a few other elections are also held via secret ballot. But however, the same section of the Representation of the People Act allows the voter to voluntarily waive off his privilege. The voter can decide to voluntarily waive off his or her privilege and disclose the vote that they have casted. In such a case, no individual or no institution or no law can prevent the voter from doing so, and no complaint can be registered against the voter for voluntarily disclosing the vote that they have cast. This issue reached the Supreme Court in relation to a no confidence motion that was moved in a Zilla Panchayat in Uttar Pradesh in 2018. During this no confidence motion, it had been alleged that the secrecy of ballot had been violated and the matter had reached the Allahabad High Court. The Allahabad High Court had observed that secrecy of ballot had indeed been violated and it had called for a revoting. The matter later reached the Supreme Court, and a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court has observed that ensuring secrecy of ballot is the cornerstone of free and fair elections, because the secret ballot system in a constitutional democracy ensures that the choice of the voter is always free. The Supreme Court has observed that it is the policy of law to protect the right of the voters to secrecy of the ballot, and even a remote or distinct possibility that a voter can be forced to disclose for whom she has voted would act as a positive constraint and a check on the freedom to exercise of franchise. So this observation of the Supreme Court reiterates that principle of secrecy of ballot is an important postulate in a constitutional democracy. The Supreme Court looked at the Zilla Panchayat rules of 1961, which mandates that the no confidence motion shall be put to vote in the prescribed manner by secret ballot, and since in this case secrecy of ballot was violated, the Supreme Court has also ordered for a revoting. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, written by former Indian diplomat Jayant Prasad. In this column, The writer highlights the twin security challenges that India faces from both China and Pakistan. In the context of ongoing tensions with China, the writer says that India should always be prepared to simultaneously deal with the two-front challenge posed by China and Pakistan. While making this statement, the writer makes a very important observation. He says that whenever India has forgotten that it has two antagonists in the region and it has let its guard down and it has been complacent in its preparation, it has paid a very high price. But on the other hand, whenever India has accounted for the possibility of a simultaneous threat from both China and Pakistan, India has done very well in securing its national interests and as well as its territory. The best way to understand this is to look at the differences between the 1962 war with China and the 1971 liberation of Bangladesh war. See, if you look at the 1962 conflict with China, there were plenty of signs for the then Nehru government to realize the expansionist and territorial tendencies of China and how it seeks to aggressively settle its territorial disputes. According to the writer, this failure of the Nehru government to read China correctly led India to ignore the warning signs that were emerging from China, and it led India to believe that the primary threat to its national security came only from Pakistan. See, there is no doubt that in the 1950s, Pakistan did pose a grave threat to India's territorial integrity. But at the same time, China should have also been seen as a similar threat because according to the writer, there were plenty of warning signs. For example, in 1950, when China annexed Tibet, it clearly sent out a signal to its expansionist and territorial tendencies. Then between 1950 and 1960, the manner in which China approached the border dispute with India should have warned India about China's inclination towards aggression. If you look at the manner in which China dismissed the validity of McMahon Line and how it increased its claims over Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh, it becomes very clear that China posed nearly the same threat as that of Pakistan to India's territorial integrity. But unfortunately, the then government of India failed to realize this threat and India ended up paying a very heavy price for this. So that's the reason why the writer is asking the current government to not be complacent while dealing with China and always prepare for a two-front challenge with both China and Pakistan. The writer says that such a strategy would help India to secure its territorial integrity and as well as its national interests, as it was seen during the 1971 liberation of Bangladesh war. Because during this conflict, the then Indira Gandhi government took into account the threat posed by both China and Pakistan and prepared the Indian armed forces, the Indian intelligence agencies and India's diplomatic outreach accordingly. See, the 1971 war traces back its origin to the genocide that the Pakistani army had committed against Bengalis in East Pakistan. So when India extended support to the liberation cause of Bangladesh, hostilities broke out between India and Pakistan. But all the while, India was mindful of the threat posed by other countries such as China and as well as by global powers such as the United States. During this period, both United States and China were expected to extend complete support to Pakistan and even possibly make a military move against India in support of Pakistan because Pakistan had emerged as a key ally of both the United States and as well as for China. Because see, during the late 1960s, then US President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, they were seeking to re-establish diplomatic ties with China, and this was a number one foreign policy priority for the United States. And it was Pakistan which acted as an ally for Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and it helped bridge the relations between the United States and China. So during this period, when India went to war against Pakistan, the United States stood with Pakistan and threatened India with military consequences. And by this time, China had already considered Pakistan as an extremely close ally against India as a result of the 1962 and 1965 conflicts. So as India began making advances against Pakistan during the 1971 war, the United States government threatened to dispatch the 7th Naval Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, and it even pushed China to exert pressure on India by launching military assaults along the Indo-China border. But thankfully, the Indira Gandhi government, which had anticipated this possible collusion between Pakistan, United States and China, had managed to secure an insurance policy from the Soviet Union. Because please remember that this was the era of the Cold War, and until the 1971 conflict, India had firmly remained non-aligned. For nearly 2 decades, India had championed the cause of the non-aligned movement, but the axis of Pakistan, US and China that was forming during the 1971 war pushed India to abandon the non-aligned approach and align with the Soviet Union, and this led to the signing of the historic Treaty of Peace and Friendship between India and the Soviet Union. Under this treaty, the Soviet Union promised to come to India's assistance if ever threatened by US and China, and this strategic move of the Indira Gandhi government helped India secure an unprecedented diplomatic and military victory. And according to the writer, this was made possible because India took into account the twin security challenges posed by both China and Pakistan simultaneously. So according to the writer, there are very important lessons that the Modi government needs to learn from the 1962 conflict. See, prior to the 1962 conflict, India had demonstrated friendliness towards China without any reciprocity, and it had displayed firmness without the actual use of force. The writer says that this led China to take India for granted, and it led India to become complacent about the threat posed by China. See, in the 1950s, even though China unilaterally annexed Tibet, and even though China was questioning India's territorial claims, India extended a hand of friendship in the interest of maintaining good relations by signing the Panchsheel Agreement and by supporting China's permanent membership of the UN Security Council. But these friendly moves of India was not reciprocated by China. Later in the late 1950s, when tensions started increasing between India and China, the Nehru government adopted a firm approach towards China through its forward policy. But despite this, the Indian side neither had the intention nor the capability to go to war against China, because the Indian government had never really contemplated a major security threat from China. The writer says that government records and transcripts of those days makes it clear that neither Prime Minister Nehru nor the then Defence Minister Krishna Menon had ever contemplated a war with China, and there was excessive focus towards Pakistan. India's diplomatic and military strategy was largely focused towards Pakistan while ignoring the threat posed by China. And it was this failure of India to take into account the two-front challenge posed by China and Pakistan which led to India's defeat in the 1962 conflict. In fact, after the war, Nehru would go on to write in 1964 that China's intention during the 1962 conflict was never really to occupy Indian territory. Instead, its intention was to send out a clear-cut message to India, to Asia and the world that China is the dominant power in the region and it would not hesitate to use aggression in order to settle any disputes. By referring to the informal Wuhan summit and the Mamlapuram summit, the writer says that the current approach of the Modi government is quite similar to the then Nehru government. Because over the last few years, the Modi government has been excessively focused on the threat posed only by Pakistan. Whereas, despite increasing aggression of China across South Asia and South China Sea, the Modi government has adopted a friendly approach towards the Chinese government, according to the writer, and it has been seeking to resolve all pending disputes only through bilateral negotiations. The writer cautions that, all the while, the Modi government is ignoring the possibility of a two-front challenge that could be posed simultaneously by China and Pakistan. The writer says that, even with regard to the Doklam dispute and the current ongoing Galwan River Valley dispute, China's real intention is not to occupy any territory. Instead, its intention is to send out a message and exert its dominance over India and as well as on the Asia-Pacific region and the rest of the world. So by keeping this in mind and the lessons of the 1962 conflict, the writer says that the Indian government needs to start preparing for a two-front challenge that could emerge simultaneously with China and Pakistan. Next, on page number 7, we have a related column in which the writer compares the developments in the run-up to the 1962 conflict with the current ongoing tensions between India and China. He cautions that there is an uncanny resemblance between the two events, and he reminds the Modi government that it was the military unpreparedness of the Nehru government and its inability to read the larger strategic picture which led to India's defeat, and he is asking the Modi government to not repeat the same mistakes. The writer says that the current Indian political leadership has failed to comprehend the long-term strategic objectives of China, and hence he is asking the top political leaders, including the Prime Minister, to first fully grasp China's strategic objectives behind triggering these minor clashes along the border before drafting a response against this Chinese aggression. See, the writer says that China is trying to achieve 4 long-term objectives by repeatedly exerting pressure along the border. First and foremost, repeated border incursions by Chinese forces shows that India does not belong in the same league as that of China. This is the message that China is trying to drive, and it is essentially an attempt of China to exert its dominance over India. Second, China is also trying to send out a clear warning for India that any attempt to contain its influence and growth in the region by allying with rival countries such as the United States, Japan, and Australia will be met with consequences. So basically, China is trying to exert itself as the predominant power in the Indo-Pacific region, and it wants India to acknowledge this without falling under the influence of the power bloc led by the United States. Third, this is also an attempt of China to keep India preoccupied with these internal and external challenges so that it can prevent the emergence of India as an alternate pole of power in Asia. Then fourth, the nexus between China and Pakistan has been designed to pin India down and keep its influence contained within the region. The strategy of China is to exert repeated pressure on India through frequent border incursions towards its north and east, and towards the west, China wants Pakistan to exert pressure on India, and this is the reason why China keeps giving massive amounts of economic aid to Pakistan and as well as extends complete support to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program and ballistic missiles program. So this nexus and twin pressure from the west, north and the east serves China's long-term strategic objective of keeping India contained and preoccupied, and this effectively prevents India from emerging as an alternate pole of power in Asia. So the writer is asking the Modi government to keep these long-term strategic objectives of China in mind and come out with calculated policies which can help neutralize China's diplomatic and military clout in the region. But this does not mean India should abandon its foreign policy principles and ally with United States, Japan and Australia, but instead he is asking India to retain its autonomy in foreign policy making. Next, on page number 14, The Hindu carries an interview with former Indian ambassador to China, Mr. Gautam Bambawale, and he goes on to explain the various protocols and agreements that India and China have signed since 1993 in order to de-escalate any border tensions. We have been speaking about these protocols and agreements over the last 1.5 months, so I would request you to go through this interview because the former Indian ambassador is of the opinion that China has probably lost India as a strategic partner for the long term for the sake of mere tactical gains on the ground. Now let's take up an article from page number 9 which deals with the Jal Jeevan mission. But before we look at this article, first let us look at the background. See, during last year's Independence Day speech, the Prime Minister announced an ambitious objective. He announced that the Government of India is planning to provide safe and adequate drinking water to all households, especially in rural India, through fixed household tap connections by 2024. This ambition of the Prime Minister was turned into the Jal Jeevan mission, which is being implemented under the Jal Shakti Ministry, and it was launched in last year's budget. This scheme not only plans to provide household tap water connections, but it also plans to implement sustainable water conservation measures at the source itself. It plans to promote mandatory recharge and reuse of water through water conservation measures, rainwater harvesting, groundwater recharge, and through grey water management or wastewater management. For the implementation of this scheme, an institutional architecture has been created from the national level to the village level, and it plans to implement water conservation measures based on a community approach, that is with the involvement of the local communities. So the panchayats at the village level are responsible for coming out with a village level action plan with the involvement of the local communities, and along with this, the government plans to launch a Jan Andolan for water conservation by promoting community involvement through extensive informational and educational outreach and by promoting awareness through effective communication. Then, since it is a centrally sponsored scheme, the funding is divided between the center and the state. For the Himalayan and the northeastern states, the funding pattern is in the 90:10 ratio, and for other states, it is in the 50:50 ratio, whereas for union territories, the scheme would be 100% funded by the center. The Jal Jeevan mission not only aims to provide fixed household tap connections to every rural household by 2024, but it also aims to provide functional tap connections to schools, Anganwadi centers, Gram Panchayat buildings, health centers, wellness centers, and community buildings at the local level. But this ambitious scheme of the government has been facing challenges in implementation as a result of funding shortages. According to a report brought out by the Jal Shakti Ministry, there has been a shortfall in funding of up to 45%, and this has affected the implementation of the Jal Jeevan Mission. So in order to address this shortfall in funding, the ministry has requested additional funding of up to 82,000 crore rupees from the 15th Finance Commission. The ministry has justified the need for such a large amount of funding because according to the ministry, providing tap connections to every household in the rural areas is going to be a capital intensive project. Especially providing tapped water connection in arid areas, in areas where there is water scarcity, and in areas where there is arsenic contamination and high salinity. The project would involve a high capital cost, and in order to meet this funding shortfall, the ministry has requested additional funding of up to 82,000 crore rupees from the 15th Finance Commission. Along with this, the ministry has also requested to exercise control over the flow of funds to the panchayats. Because over the last 1 year, the Jal Shakti Ministry has been unhappy about the implementation of the scheme at the panchayat level. Data from the ministry shows that a large part of the funds that have been allocated to the panchayats remain unutilized, and upon this, the money that has been spent has not been utilized effectively. So due to these issues in implementation at the ground level, the Jal Shakti Ministry has sought to exercise direct control over the flow of funds to the panchayats. It wants to make the flow of funds to the panchayats conditional based on the panchayat's ability to adhere to the village level action plan that has been finalized. Now let's take up an article from page number 16 which deals with the golden langur. See, the golden langur is a highly threatened species of monkey which has been listed as endangered by the IUCN. This threatened species is endemic to western Assam and the Black Mountains of Bhutan. The habitat in which you find the golden langur is made up of semi-evergreen and mixed deciduous forests, and in western Assam, the golden langur is confined to a very small habitat that is bound by 3 rivers. In western Assam, the habitat of the golden langur is bound by the Brahmaputra river to the south, by the Manas river to the east, by the Sankosh river to the west, and by the Black Mountains of Bhutan to the north. As per the 2009 census, the population of these monkeys in Assam was just above 5,000, but their population is being threatened as a result of habitat fragmentation. This small habitat of the golden langurs has been fragmented mainly because of electrical wires, and a number of monkeys have died as a result of electrocution. The fragmentation of this small habitat is promoting inbreeding within the species, and this is pushing the golden langurs to practice forced abortion and infanticide. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. The Sirimavo Shastri Pact dealt with tariff exemptions for Sri Lankan exports to India, resolution of the Kachativo Island dispute, citizenship status of Indian Tamils in Sri Lanka, delineation of maritime boundary between India and Sri Lanka. The correct answer is option C. See, to be able to answer this question, first you need to understand the demography of Sri Lanka. You might be aware that Sri Lanka is a Sinhala Buddhist country, but Sri Lanka also has a significant Tamil population, and the minority Tamils are classified as Indian Tamils and Sri Lankan Tamils. See, the Sri Lankan Tamils are the ones who have settled in the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka through the natural process of migration over the centuries. Whereas Indian Tamils are the ones who were taken as labourers by the British government to work in the coffee, tea and spice plantations of the central highlands of Sri Lanka. During the colonial rule, the Sinhala Buddhist majority had always resisted the rise of the Indian Tamil population. So immediately after gaining independence, the Sinhala Buddhist majority pressurized the Sri Lankan government to introduce a controversial set of citizenship laws in 1948, which basically rendered the Indian Tamils stateless. The Sri Lankan government claimed that the responsibility of the Indian Tamils lies on the Indian government, and it even spoke about repatriating the Indian Tamils back to India. But India refused to take up any legal responsibility for Indian Tamils, but it did express a sentimental interest in ensuring the well-being of the Indian Tamils. So this issue led to the emergence of a dispute between India and Sri Lanka, and it was supposed to be resolved through the Sirimavo Shastri Pact, which was signed in 1964. The then Sri Lankan Prime Minister Sirimavo Bandaranaike and the then Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri negotiated an agreement through which around 3 lakh Indian Tamils were supposed to be granted Sri Lankan citizenship, whereas another 5 lakh Indian Tamils were supposed to be repatriated back to India. And the status of another 1.5 lakh Indian Tamils was supposed to be decided by the Sri Lankan government at a later date. But this agreement failed to resolve the dispute entirely, and the continued oppression and discrimination against Indian Tamils and as well as the Sri Lankan Tamils in the northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka led to the emergence of Tamil nationalism and Tamil separatist feelings in the 1970s and 1980s. This laid the foundation for the emergence of a civil war in the 1980s led by the LTTE and other Tamil militant outfits. This question has been asked because the 50 years ago article from page number 7 makes a reference to the Sirimavo Shastri Pact. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Madhesi community frequently seen in news resides in which country? The correct answer is option B, Nepal. See, the Madhesi community can be found in the Terai belt of Nepal that is located over here at the foothills of the Himalayas, and this plain area shares a border with the Indian states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. The Madhesis who inhabit the Terai belt, they share a close cultural relation with the Indian side, but they have always felt oppressed and discriminated against by the Pahadi community which resides in the hilly areas of Nepal. So over the years, the support of the Indian government to the Madhesi cause has always created a rift between the Indian government and the Nepali government, and Nepal's political parties accuse India of interfering in its internal affairs. A few years ago, when Nepal's constitution was being drafted, India tried its best to ensure that the Madhesis' interests are represented in the constitution. But the final constitution which was adopted left the Madhesis disappointed, and it pushed the Madhesis to impose an economic blockade along the Indo-Nepal border. This blockade ended up crippling Nepal's economy since it's a landlocked country that is dependent excessively on India, and it led the Nepali government and Nepal's political parties to blame India for this economic blockade. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 14 according to which Madhesis have opposed the proposed changes to Nepal's existing citizenship laws. These proposed changes, if implemented, will bring in a mandatory 7-year waiting period before foreign women who are married to Nepali men can acquire Nepali citizenship. But as we discussed, the Madhesis of the Terai belt, they share a close cultural relationship, so it is natural for a number of Madhesi men to have married foreign women, and if these changes are introduced to Nepal citizenship laws, then it will make it all the more difficult for them to acquire Nepali citizenship. Hence, Madhesis have been opposed to these proposed changes, and they have termed these changes as racially motivated. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Bhopal gas tragedy pushed the government of India to enact the Environment Protection Act in 1986. It was enacted through Article 253 of the Constitution. The purpose of the Act was to implement India's commitment to the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. They relate to the protection and improvement of the human environment and the prevention of hazards to human beings, other living creatures, plants and property. All the 4 statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. See, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment of 1972, or also known as the Stockholm Conference, mandated India and other countries to implement a national legislation that could protect and improve human environment and prevent hazards to human beings, other living creatures, plants and property. But for nearly 14 years, India had failed to bring in such a legislation, and finally the push came from the Bhopal gas tragedy. After this industrial disaster, the Indian government made use of Article 253 to introduce the Environment Protection Act. Because Article 253 empowers the Parliament to pass a legislation even on subjects that fall under the state list and the concurrent list in order to help India implement its commitments to international treaties and conventions. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, 74% of the COVID-19 deaths in Bhopal have been related to gas tragedy survivors. This goes on to show the impact of comorbidities in increasing the fatality rate amongst COVID-19 patients. It also goes on to show the long-term impact of the Bhopal gas tragedy. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. With reference to Mia Tansen, which one of the following statements is not correct? Tansen was the title given to him by Emperor Akbar. Tansen composed Drupads, on Hindu gods and goddesses. Tansen composed songs on his patrons. Tansen invented many ragas. Amongst these statements, option A is incorrect, because the title Tansen was not given by Emperor Akbar. In fact, the title Mia Tansen was given by Emperor Akbar. The title Tansen was given by Raja Vikramjit of Gwalior. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: secrecy of ballot is the cornerstone of free and fair elections. Discuss in the light of the recent judgment of the Supreme Court. The second question: in the context of India's conflict with China and Pakistan, it is often said that whenever India has forgotten that it has two antagonists and let its guard down, it has paid dearly for it. Conversely, whenever India has accounted for the prospect of a possible threat from both quarters, it has done well. Examine the statement. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.